sort of a Q. So, welcome to this Guild of Health Writers Q&A panel discussion. It's basically about surviving as a writer in the ChatGPT era, which we hear on the grapevine that a lot of people are quite threatened by at the moment. A lot of work being lost in kind of marketing and those sort of areas and PR. And so we've heard a lot of this from copywriters, people who do a bit PR. I think everyone's starting to get the jitters a bit about it. So today the idea is that we look at the challenges of working with ChatGPT and AI, and also look at some possible other income streams in medcoms, which we would argue that a lot of health and medical writers do have those transferable skills. There is work for you in other sectors if you are feeling the squeeze in the medical and health writing sector. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and it's very much the audience contributing as well about their experiences and maybe asking some questions. So we've got the Guild's own Corinne Swanger, who's going to talk about her consultancy, Mediquil, and how she thinks that health and medical writers do have transferable skills which would be in demand. And then we've got Annette Keith, who's the Executive Scientific Director at Langland, and she'll be speaking about the medcoms sector and why some health writers do have transferable skills for particular areas anyway. And also Peter Llewellyn, who's founder of the medcoms network and a medcoms workbook, and he could talk about some of the challenges of ChatGPT and AI and the kind of benefits of networking in this sector as well. So I don't know who wants to go first. I don't think we've worked that out, but maybe Corinne, would you like to kick off?
Yes. Well, basically, I'm a member of both the Guild and pretty active in the medcoms industry. I started out as a PR writer, copywriter, and editor, but that was mainly in patient publications. I happened to get an internship in the US with a hospital that was very commercially based. So you were targeting healthcare professionals, patients, payers, you name it. I don't have a PhD, but I haven't really needed one because being in the industry about 35 years, I've had to adapt. I've had to use my journalistic skills and move on to other areas. So you're talking about PR, copywriting, advertising, medical education, something called medical affairs. It all uses journalistic skills, the ones that you've got right now as healthcare writers. And I think, for anyone out there who hasn't considered it, medcoms is an ideal opportunity to use those skills. But, I don't think you have to be a specialist per se, because it helps that as a journalist, you can understand different aspects of healthcare. I'll let somebody else pick up. And,
so, perhaps I'll just introduce myself a little more details. Not this is all about me, but so I basically, in my role as Langland is a medical communications agency, and I head up a team of just over 30 medical writers and scientific directors within that team. We have 4 disciplines within Langland, so we cover advertising, PR, clinical trials experience, and then medical strategy and education, which is where all our medical writers sit. So we do have writers across all of those disciplines, but my main concern is those ones within our medical strategy and education team. So many of you may know the medcoms world already, but just to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. Most of our work is writing for an audience of healthcare professionals, usually secondary or tertiary care specialists, because we work for pharmaceutical companies who are educating around their products and the diseases that they treat. And obviously most branded products these days are in more secondary care than they are in primary care. There's a few things like asthma and things like that we might deal with that broach into the primary care space, but it's mainly kind of secondary care. So We do some materials for patients as well, but particularly around perhaps the communications between healthcare professionals and patients, and help to support those. But primarily our kind of medical education is communicating to healthcare professionals. That said, and I be very interesting to hear your experiences in kind of health writing. It's not my specialty at all, so it's something I don't know very much about. But it is true, just from following on from Kareem, that writing skills, which are such an important and probably a slightly dying skill. Let's hope that it doesn't, but are very much valued, because no matter who you're communicating to, whether it's a lay audience or whether it's a busy doctor, the clearer you can get across your key points, the better. Without, I'm always talking to our writers about, basically you need to write, so people need to use as the minimal cognitive effort, because doctors obviously are, clever people, but they don't have time. And why would they want to read what we're providing to them? And we need to be able to write in a compelling, interesting, impactful way, where they don't need to use a lot of effort to do that. So I think those kind of skills are very transferable. I think the good thing about diving in just yet, we'll probably have some questions first, but the good thing about medical writing is I think that the job is so much more than writing. So I would say 50% of the job is being able to write well, and the other 50% is a whole host of different things about good scientific understanding, strategic understanding of the industry, being able to communicate well internally and with clients, creative ideas, data interpretation, all that kind of thing. So it's a very, I think that's one of the reasons to the, getting right to the sort of nub of this webinar as well. We shouldn't be threatened by ChatGPT, is I think ChatGPT can only do a small portion of that. And I think it is a useful tool, and we can discuss that in more detail, but there's a lot more to being a medical writer than just the writing. What do you think, Peter?
Okay, shall I pick that up? Hi, everybody. So my name is Peter Llewellyn. If you don't know me, I run the medcomsnetworking.com or the Medcoms Networking community. If you go to medcomsnetworking.com, you'll find a whole load of information, resources, activities for people who work in and around Medcoms. Medcoms is a little bit of a contrived terminology, and one of the things I think we should flag straight away is that the three of us will differ in our definition of medcoms, and I could bring another 10 people along and we'd all have very different, and in some cases very, very different definitions of medcoms. Okay, so we just need to tread a little bit carefully around that. But it's the way I see it, it's the sort of the more technical scientific end of the medical communication spectrum. It's not advertising, it's not PR, it's also not really sort of true medical education in terms of accredited type of medical education, which is the other end of the spectrum. But medcoms is somewhere in there, and it sort of strays into all of those areas and more. But it tends to be obviously about communicating information about disease information, medicines, and so on. As Annette's saying, it tends to be directed to the healthcare professionals. But one of the things that's happened over the last few years is it's proliferated. The business has proliferated in terms of the types of content that is being produced, the types of delivery channels that are being used, the types of audiences. When I was doing medcoms a long time ago, it really was very much sort of writing manuscripts for print for usually healthcare professionals. Now there's obviously a whole array of digital type platforms and solutions. So you might have very short content type deliverables, or you might still have the very large, lengthy, monograph type of aspect, or peer review publication and so on. Lots and lots of slides, presentations at meetings and so on. You might be doing that for key opinion leaders. You might be sitting around a table with the 6 key opinion leaders, in any one therapeutic area, talking about a medicine that's 5 years away from launch. It can be very exciting and very bleeding edge, or it can be producing information for general practitioners. When you think in terms of a new product being launched into a marketplace, increasingly there's multidisciplinary teams involved, pharmacists, nurses, and so on. And I think we've all always said we've got the patient in mind, but that, the patient voice has become very important. And I would argue that most medcoms agencies aren't delivering a lot of information that's directed at patients. However, some do. Most do some, and some do a lot. What is becoming apparent over the last couple of years is incorporating, as it were, I hate the terminology actually, but the patient voice into what we do. So you will find quite a few examples now, medcoms agencies, where they're involving patients or patient advocates, patient groups in developing content for healthcare professionals or whatever. And there's a huge span of things going on there. And I think that's one of the things that we just need to emphasize when we're talking, because we'll end up talking about silos and labels on particular types of activity. Actually, there's a huge range of activity going on around that, which brings with it the requirement for a huge range of skills. Okay. One thing I think in this context I should make very clear, in terms of me and what I do, is I'm not a medical writer, and I don't profess to be. So my background was microbiology, pharmaceutical industry, clinical research, sales and marketing, into what you'd now call a medcoms agency, although in those days, and we are going back in time, medcoms wasn't really a term. So it was sort of a med ed agency, as they used to be called, which would sit alongside the advertising and PR agencies. I got a bit overexcited about the internet when that came along, and got very excitable and developed online resources for the pharmaceutical industry. Never really put that behind me. And then I started what is called medcoms networking about 17 years ago. So again, just emphasizing, there's a plus and a minus to me having been around a while. Okay, so I can see how it was and how it's developed and how things have changed. But medcoms networking, 17 years or so of me basically, and it sounds a bit stupid in some ways, or it looks a bit stupid to some people. I just try and encourage people in and around this business to talk to each other. When I started doing it, there was places you could go in advertising or PR. There were awards, there were meetings, there was activity. There wasn't really very much for the people that I was calling medcoms. And I started running events for those people, and we sort of found that it was actually quite nice to get together, sort of thing. And what has evolved from that is, I think, really quite interesting. I mean, I often say if I had a time machine, I would go back and shoot myself and stop myself doing it, sort of thing. But I have developed this resource, a global community of people. I think what I do is quite useful, but probably unlike most other things, it's not a membership organization. There's no mandate. I haven't got a membership that I can go, I'm speaking on behalf of. And funding wise is always the big mystery. People go, how are you making any money out of that? Well, I have a number of companies, and Annette Langland are one of those companies that sponsor what I do. On the basis they all put a little bit in the pot, and that gives me a pot that I can do something with, and I get quite excitable, and I do stuff, and you can do a lot of stuff digitally these days. I can run meetings, I can do it online, I can do stuff in a way that a lot of other people, a lot of other organizations can't, because they have committees or whatever saying we have to do this or that. So if you go to medcomsnetworking.com, you'll find all sorts of things going on. And I'm always very interested in championing the business and trying to encourage people to take notice of business, because it's been talked about very much as an invisible business over the years. A lot of people in the industry don't know much about medcoms, for instance. Whereas I think in the last few years, I have been a part of getting the message out that there is this business here and explaining what we do. Also very much, I've been part of going out and telling people in academia and so on that this business exists. And medcoms for the last ever since I've really been involved in it, has been saying we need more people in the business. In the last couple of years, it has boomed. There's no two ways about it. Companies like Annette and all the companies have mushroomed in size. There was a point very early on, and I remember it very clearly, in sort of March of 2020, that was what it was, where everyone went a little bit scared. It's like, oh my goodness me, we're locking down. What's going to happen? Actually, medcoms benefited and boomed from the COVID era, or however you want to describe it. Lots and lots of information coming through quickly. I think Annette will talk about this much more knowledgeably than me, but there was lots of work being done. And also medcoms was already becoming quite a flexible working force. So there were a lot of people who were starting to work quite flexibly. I don't think we were working as remotely and flexibly as people now say that we were at the time, because I remember having arguments about it. And in those days, you know, working flexibly meant, well, you've got a laptop, and if you want to carry on working tonight, you can carry on working tonight at home. Whereas now it's much more, because of the lockdown and so on, it embraced the fact that people could work at home. That makes it an interesting business from some points of view, because people can work in medcoms from wherever, certainly on a freelance basis. From a freelance point of view, it's offered enormous opportunity to people. There's no two ways about it. A lot of people go into medcoms, and there's no way of tracking this, but a lot of people go on, particularly on the medical writing side, into freelance type positions. And as I say, partly because of flexible working, partly because of the digital type nature of the tools and so on, people can work from wherever and write and join in and so on. And what's changed over the last couple of years is how the companies have embraced technology that enables virtual working to be done properly. So it's not as simple as it was a few years ago, where I would have a freelance writer and I would just go wherever in the world you are, write a manuscript, send it to me. I mean, again, Annette will talk more about this, or can talk more about this. You know, the systems within an agency are set up for everyone to be working virtually, and the freelancer can sort of slot in. I would say there's been a boom, and I think we would all nod our heads at that. I think one of the interesting conversations at the moment is quite what's going on in medcoms. There is no doubt it has a different feel about it at the moment than there was a year ago. There's no doubt, in my opinion, that medcoms is quietening down a little bit in terms of recruitment and activity, partly just relative to the last couple of years. But maybe we're not quite sure how that's panning out. A lot of freelancers, for instance, are saying it's a little bit different at the moment. But that's not the same as saying there's not a lot of work out there. And I think that's one of the things that when we get together and talk, when I get the freelancers together and talk and so on, there's a lot of discussion to be had around that topic. There are freelancers who are busier than they've ever been. There are other freelancers who will say, I've never seen it quite like this. I'm having to go out and knock on doors and get work, sort of thing. I personally run, just for full transparency, medcomsnetworking.com and a number of other resources. You'll find Network Pharma TV. There's several hundred videos now. I run webinars all the time and I record them. There's lots of videos of all sorts of topics around medcoms. So there's quite a lot of interesting information, I would hope. There's a site called firstmedcomsjob.com, which is about bringing people into the industry. But importantly and specifically, I also run the Medcoms workbook, which is about freelancers, and there's about 250 freelancers on that service. I do a couple of things. One is I act as a channel. So if someone's looking for freelancer to do work, then they can give me a message and I can pass it on. And from a client point of view, that's free. The freelancers, it's a very small annual fee that they pay to become part of it, but they get those work opportunities. But I'm personally very keen, if anything, I'm keener on the fact that gives the freelancers a community and a network of people that can support each other. And I'm not sure what the right word is, and Corinne and Annette might want to be rude about it, but I am known as someone who bangs on about the importance of networking, community, and so on. As an example, I've just written an article in the latest issue of EMWA's journal, the European Medical Writers Association journal, which was about networking. And what I specifically went out and found were people around the world who were running little networking groups and communities of different sorts in different ways, and put that together in an article, which I think was the first time that actually happened. But I think it highlighted the fact that there's the opportunity, you know, it's good, particularly for freelancers, you know, who can be a bit isolated. And these days it's quite easy to find other groups, particularly online. But Corinne, for instance, runs a little group who meet in Northwest London and, you know, get together for dinner once in a while and so on. But any which way you can, I think it's important. Meetings like this are very important, or just the informal type meetings where people just get together either around a dinner table or online and share ideas. I think particularly for freelancers, it's hugely important. Can be quite difficult to get people to talk about things. I have personally banged my head against a lot of brick walls just trying to get people to open up and talk. But if we can, then it's very, very useful. Specifically with, I'm plotting very quickly over a bunch of different areas there. ChatGPT, just to address that one. And when we're talking AI, we've got to be a little bit careful. Firstly, because most of us don't really know what we're talking about. So let's put that one out there. Secondly, AI covers an enormous range of activity. Specifically, what was the point here, I think what Joe was keen on was talking about ChatGPT and those sorts of tools specifically. For what it's worth, I got a bit excitable over Christmas and started talking to some people on LinkedIn about ChatGPT, which was just then being talked about, and how it could be used in medcoms. And I, you know, as an example of the way I work, I think it was 4 of them to agree. I just said, let's run a webinar. Let's just get online and talk about this, because none of us know what we're talking about. Let's just talk about this. And in Medcom's networking terms, it was huge, because 10 days later, I had 1,000 people registered for this webinar. It was amazing looking back at what was happening over December, January, as people were starting to think there's something in this. And it's quite cute and quaint if you go back and look at that recording. It's all on Network Pharma TV. I think our conversation was rather naive, but it was interesting that, and then in the weeks that followed, I ran several more webinars. And I don't think I really understand how this is going to be used in real life. I don't understand how it is being used. My own personal view is it's more transformative than most people think it and give it credit for. My basic message has been, if nothing else, at least go and have a play with it. It's not that, a few weeks ago, I could have been asking a bunch of Medcom's medical writers if they'd even heard of ChatGPT, and some wouldn't, but most probably would. But if I asked the question, which I was asking at that time, have you actually played with it? Have you actually done something? Just played with it? A surprising number of medical writers and Medcoms were going, no, and they would giggle slightly and say either, well, one of a range of things. There were some agencies that were simply saying, do not touch it. And what was curious about that to me was those individuals were not then just going home and trying it at home. So what if the business won't let me use it at business? But I'm a curious, interesting sort of, person. I'm a medical writer. Why wouldn't I go and try this? But surprising numbers of people weren't. Quite a few people were just going, well, so-and-so is briefed to look at this, so I'm too busy. I don't know what it means. I'm hearing that, it's a bit scary if I look at it, but in reality, I'm hearing that it makes things up and it's not accurate. So it doesn't sound like it's going to affect my job. I'm a clever person. I'm a writer. Everyone's going to want me in it. Fred over there or Sue over there is looking at that. I questioned why they didn't go and find something to do with it themselves. What seems to have happened, and I don't know whether Annette's got a view on this, but I would say from my perspective, what's happening at the moment is a lot of people aren't talking about it at all, because within agencies, there are now working parties and groups and individuals who've been briefed to look at this from the point of view of what does it mean for us as a business? And suddenly it's become a competitive thing. And it's all just gone a little bit quieter. And I find that intriguing. But my personal view remains that, particularly as you get into the sorts of writing we're talking about in Medcoms, but it's a spectrum. That ChatGPT type tools are a hugely useful tool, will transform some of the way in which some of the work is done, but by no means replace writers, particularly at the cleverer, more scientific end, if you like, in the interpretive end. The point in there that I think we have to stress or remember is that if you look at Medcoms, take this average Medcoms writer that doesn't exist and think about the spectrum of activities that goes on. Some of the activity is actually just very mundane stuff. It's reviewing, it's summarizing, it's and actually the AI tools can do some of that extremely easily, extremely accurately. And the writer's involvement is more about fact checking and strategic type question, rather than actually sitting there and writing something, which a tool can do. I still don't think we're talking openly enough in our business about it. As I say, I think some of the agencies are now clamping down and going, don't talk about it while we figure it out. I do find it interesting to question how the pharma companies are working with the agencies now, the questions that are being raised and so on. But there are certain things that the ChatGPT just does brilliantly. And the example that I'll just finish with, because I just think it just, for me, it illustrates the point. I'm sure if anyone's had kids, many of us have had kids, it's a while ago now, but I've said this a few times in this sort of forum, I've sat there and I thought, if I had a 4-year-old kid today or a 3-year-old kid today, and I went through a phase where I would be going, I'm bored of, or they're both he was bored of reading the stories. Let's make up a story ourselves. And I was never very good at that sort of thing. If you get your bottle of red and your first glass of red and you go, here we go, and here's my iPad, let's get ChatGPT. I tell you what, Joe, or whatever your son's name or daughter's name is, why don't we make a story up today? What would you like to do? And they go, oh, I'd like to go and, I don't know, head off to the hills and do this, and I want to wear these clothes and eat this sort of, and etc. And you just go, yes, and you give ChatGPT an unlimited number of prompts, and boom, it comes back with a story. and you read it and it's a bit of fun, and then you go, that's getting a bit boring, let's have another story, Dad, you know, and you're onto your third bottle of wine or something, but you're going, well, ChatGPT isn't bored, isn't you know, it just goes, yeah, okay, let's just do more. Okay, now that doesn't stop, what's her name, Julia Donaldson is the example I used, you know, writing her books, and it will always be on a different level. But I think there's an amazing magical tool there that at times in my life I could have used, and it would have been brilliant. Now, it doesn't work for everybody, but in my head, that's just a lovely example about how something can actually make life a little bit easier in some ways. It can bring a magic to something that was a bit of a struggle. But I don't think, as I say, it stops Julia Donaldson earning her money. Having said that, I do wonder whether someone like Julia Donaldson, having written a whole load of books, gets to a stage where she says, you know what, I'm running out of ideas here. Maybe a tool like ChatGPT can help come up with some different ideas and some different ways of looking at things. So I've covered a lot of ground in there. Some of it's a very personal opinion. Hopefully that at least paints a picture of where I'm coming from. Does it?
Well, I think picking up on that, Peter, I decided to play around with ChatGPT, and yeah, okay. So I said, okay, write me an article, 500-word article about the pros and cons of being a freelance medical writer. Yeah, and bingo, it came up with them. Then I said, okay, different prompts. Okay, now put it in bullet point form. Now write it for someone who's never heard of medical writing before. Now write it for a scientist. It came up with all this different stuff. But each and every time, I think looking at that, it definitely was long and lengthy. Didn't put any references in there, obviously, and difficult to understand because, again, long and lengthy, it needed editing. It needed an angle as well. Anything you're going to get from ChatGPT is going to need editing. I think from a journalistic point of view, also, you're looking at storytelling. Okay, what, you know, any journalist has to figure out what's the angle that you want to come at from a certain, you know, story, article, who you're targeting it at. You targeting at patients, you know, doctors, nurses? Who are you targeting at? What level are you going to write on? Again, you know, journalists can take their skills and do that. But looking at these different articles, it was great to come up with that basic idea, but it was far from done. Yeah.
Okay, but I just a couple of things. I mean, firstly, and again, well, in certain situations, is it not useful to have that first starting point?
Oh yeah.
Okay,
it would.
and that
Yeah.
that can save hours of time trying to figure out where the starting point is.
Mhm.
And sometimes I suspect it gets it more right than people would have expected. And if someone's looking at it and going, well, actually, on this occasion, in this particular scenario, that's actually done most of the work quite quickly, and I can now finish it off. Or they say, well, actually, that needs a lot of work done on it because I can see what the problems are. But that's an incredibly useful tool if you go into it positively.
Yeah.
The thing about referencing and so on, I think is a bit of a red herring because some of that will be dealt with very easily. If you imagine something like Merck, I don't know if anyone's got any direct experience or knowledge of it, but Merck have certainly done it. And I think it's Sanofi have done it as well. They've got their own effectively GPT systems set up using their own data. If you ring fence the data, or Pharma GPT that Steve Mott's doing, where you ring fence an enormous amount of verified, rigorous data, and then you ask that a question, human beings can't move that fast, can't know that much. The tool gives you the answers and does it in such a useful, friendly, user-friendly way that becomes very, very interesting. One of the things about ChatGPT is it's a work in progress, and we shouldn't talk about or think about ChatGPT as that's the product. Does it work or doesn't it? If it doesn't work, it's no good. It's a work in progress. And if you look at even the couple of versions we've had this year, the difference between the two has been enormous. And look at what's come as a result of that. And as I say, if you look at these ring-fence domain-specific type systems, I'll come back to Pharma GPT and Steve. That is an enormously useful tool. Enormously useful. But what do you think, Annette?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it is a useful tool. I'm excited, but I was one of those people that's playing with it, you know, and I don't, like you, Peter, I don't really understand why more people aren't interested in what it does. And I really don't think we should be writing it off as like, well, it doesn't do this and it doesn't do that. It's all about learning how to use it and knowing the expectations. And I think one of the big things that I, you know, keep banging my drum about, which is no different from how I've, you know, viewed this my whole career, is from a writing perspective, it's all about accountability. I expect my writers to be able to defend every single word on the page that they write. and it doesn't matter, you know, that's the same 15 years ago as it is now. Now, if they've got ChatGPT to help them, honestly, I don't care. As long as this is, by the way, this is my personal opinion. It doesn't necessarily reflect, you know, everybody else in my company. But, you know, as long as that accountability is there and things have been checked and it's true and people aren't using it, being lazy and just, you know, then I think it's got huge, you know, benefit, because everybody knows that I think the hardest thing is starting from a blank page. So, I mean, I've tried it. I haven't used it tons in work, to be honest. I mean, it's very, I think the other thing to say about medcoms is because a lot of the information that we're dealing with is not necessarily in the public domain, that ChatGPT is, and we can't put anything, you know, confidential in there. There's actually very limited scope to use it currently. I think things will change in the future, but currently there's very limited scope to use it for the day-to-day work. Doesn't mean to say that it isn't useful in certain situations. So I haven't used it a lot for work. I've used it for a few bits and pieces. But I think, like you said, I think it's better than you think it might be. It's sort of shockingly good sometimes, and it's definitely helped me to kind of, you know, think, you know, if you're medcoms, I mean, we spend half your time trying to think of creative symposium titles or things like that, and, you know, again, everyone who's been in the industry for long enough, you know, we've all done New Horizons, and, you know, goodness knows what it is. You know, you can give it a good prompt, you can get some good, you know, give me 10 titles for a symposium, farmer run symposium on X, Y, and Z. None of them I would use verbatim, but they give me a starting point. I've got 10 on the list. It's taken 30 seconds rather than, you know, 10 people, 30 minutes. So yeah, I think it's definitely got its uses. But yeah, for me, it just accountability. Like we can't be putting over that kind of responsibility onto you know, a program like ChatGPT, because that would be a very bad thing for.
And we must remember it makes things up, and you know, if you understand how ChatGPT works, well, it's very obvious why it does it. But a lot of people don't think about that, and you get a very confident piece of text, possibly with references, and it's very easy to walk away and go, job done. And we're in a business, like Jeanette's saying, where we're very, very worried about the accuracy of data and all the rest of it, and we're trained to think about it. And so the thing that scares me is how much of the world doesn't think like that. If I see my boys, you know, and what they read and what they assume is correct, and the lack of questioning, and, you know, and the way they'll just grab something, and if it's I don't know, so it's not a fair example really, but, you know, I can think of the younger one who just wants to get his homework done and out of the way because he hates the whole thing. You know, he'll grab something off ChatGPT and go, look, it looks okay, so send it in because that's dealt with the problem till tomorrow, sort of thing. And we are a society which, you know, he says pompously, you know, and I say I'm not a writer, so I have to bow to the writers. But we're a society that's increasingly become, you know, accepting of mediocrity. You know, we only have to look at some of the news websites and newspapers and books and all this and go, you know, but there's typos, there's errors, there's whatever, you know, and we are in a business which is very worried about that sort of thing. I've just been sent something to review and add a testimonial to. It took me bloody hours, and in the end I was just getting cross because all I was doing was finding errors, and I've just sent it back to the guys and said, look, you know, you need this, the content's fine, but you need someone who actually can do this properly, you know, check the copy editing, the proofreading, all this stuff, you know, but there's an acceptance amongst a lot of people these days that this stuff doesn't really matter very much. We're all doing it tech speak anyway, so what the hell. So again, it's interesting because if you're in a business that's extremely worried about that sort of quality of information and so on, which I would argue we are in medcoms, then anything that sort of feels like it isn't going to be as good as that can feel quite offensive. But we're working in a world where everyone else isn't quite so worried as us, and budgets and money matter. Take an example, and again, what do you two think about this or anybody else? Over the last few years, there's been more and more talk of PLS, plain language summaries. So the idea is you've got a paper published in the journal or whatever. Let's make it more accessible to people. Let's make a plain language summary. And there's one level of discussion which is that's just a good thing. There's a business level to that discussion. And what was happening, I would argue, only really last year, was after years of talking about it, a lot of people were starting to go, yes, PLS is a thing. I reckon, and I paint this picture where I reckon that in some agencies they were going, right, there's a revenue stream there now. Okay, it's the publishers are starting to put up platforms and so on. So take a PLS from a paper. What we have to do is put an expert writer on it for a week to produce this excellent PLS, right? Written for, then there's some discussion about quite at what level you write it and so on. One of the things that happened over Christmas, almost immediately when ChatGPT came along, where people were basically putting these articles into ChatGPT and going, produce a plain language summary for, you know, a reading age of whatever. And it was doing it. And it was actually doing it amazingly well compared to what people were expecting. And then there's been this big fight. You can see it on LinkedIn, you know, the expert medical writers going, oh, this is rubbish. You know, it hasn't got authenticity. It can't quite catch the nuance that I can as a medical writer, and so on and so forth. But if you're the sort of person that's going, look, we have an SOP now that says every article has to have a PLS. It's just part of the process. And actually the PLS that's coming out of a AI tool is not bad and it ticks the box. I think there's an interesting, you know, there's an interesting area for discussion in there as to how far you go and how much you spend in trying for perfection versus how much you do in just trying to get the job done and get the stuff out there. And it's quite a hot potato. And the sort of people that I work around don't like talking about that sort of thing, but I think it's a real issue. Another point that I'll just throw in, and again, it's a webinar that I've done with more on the regulatory writing side. Lisa Chamberlain got involved with me on a webinar a few weeks ago. I'm losing track of time, but maybe it's about March, April time, and a couple of her colleagues, much more on the regulatory writing side. And I would draw a distinction between medcoms and regulatory. Regulatory, by definition, you're writing the documents for the regulatory agencies and so on. Lots of medical writing going on there. And basically a huge demand, you know, there's more work than they've got writers for. What part of Lisa's argument was the AI tools that they've developed and that they're working with are slashing some of the time out of the workflow. And that's hugely useful because they've got more work that they can deal with, so they can do more work. Again, it's a different way of thinking of it. It's not so much saying it's taking people's jobs as it's freeing up some of the people that are here that are overworked and can't keep up, and we can't find people to add to them. And it's just expanding the workload. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I think if you know, there's a lot of writers out there like myself who've looked at it and said, okay, for example, creatively, as you mentioned, you know, what sort of creative angle can you come up with something? I think the main thing that we need to perhaps look at from a creative point of view is, can we come up with something original? I mean, you ask Dr. Google about something and he's going to just, like maybe AI, just repeat stuff that's already out there, you know, maybe even plagiarize what's already out there. But if you're trying to promote a certain, you know, disease awareness or a product or a new treatment, you've got to come up with an original angle. That takes critical thinking, it takes strategy. AI can throw something at you, but you know, let's take that and run with it and look at it from a different angle. I don't think AI can necessarily do that all the time, but I agree, it's a very useful tool.
I think you're probably right up to a point. However, there's been some amazing fun and games played with ChatGPT. You know, think of yourself as Shakespeare and write this, or think of yourself as this sort of a person or that sort of thing and write something about this. And ultimately, it's not completely creative because it's working on a database of information. But then most of us aren't completely creative all the time. You know, we're actually just using our brains and our experience and our, you know, and what we know. It can just do that on a much, much larger level sort of thing. So, and also a lot of the work we have to do doesn't need a creative angle. You know, it's summarizing information because doctors are too busy to go and look at all the literature on medicine X. So part of our job is to go, right, we'll summarize all that information into easy formats that can then be accessed by those people. So there are different things going on in there. The other thing another way to look at ChatGPT and those sorts of tools is, which I think is quite interesting, and it's gathering a lot more engagement now, is because there's a lot of talk about it as a search engine, and it's not good as a search engine because it's not up to date, but now it's attached to search engines and things. But the basic point is you can ask ChatGPT to tell you about something, and it will tell you. It'll write a little story, as it were, some pro. I don't know, I'm going to go and see Bayer Pharmaceuticals next week or something like that. You know, I want to know what sort of products they're involved in and what areas and what blah, blah, blah. And ChatGPT or Flipping Well just give you a document that you can sit and read on the train as you go there, sort of thing. What you used to do 6 months ago was you'd ask Google what Bayer was involved in, you'd get 150 billion references back, and you'd start working your way through and researching and trying to figure it out for yourself. ChatGPT can just give you something that you can sit and read on the train as you go, and it's actually distilled that information, just gone, here it is. Again, it's a different way of looking at it. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of, I'm just conscious, there's so many things that we could pick up on in this webinar. I don't know, Joe or anybody else on the call, whether there's any questions or anything specifically that.
Well, I would be interested in turning around a bit.
Forever.
I'd be interested in turning around a bit, because I mean, we're looking at some faces here, and some of you are nodding, and some of you are looking like you don't agree with me. Also, but you know, I would be. This is a different group. It should be a different group of people sitting here than I'm certainly used to using. It would be interesting to hear from some of you. I mean, what I also think we should do, possibly the three of us, is talk a little bit more about the opportunities for you in medcoms, and I think we can talk a bit about that. But just on this particular point, I am intrigued as to how you're seeing ChatGPT type tools affecting what you're doing, how you're using them, because you are in a slightly different, well, you're in a very different sort of marketplace to us. So can I turn that around to anyone in the audience who's willing to tell us a little bit about how it's working for you?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about how I've used it. I mean, I've gone freelance again now, but I was working at a company called Healthily, which is a health platform, and it had fully referenced articles on it. And so we were encouraged to sort of, you know, play around with it and see what we thought and things. And at that stage, I think that was about back in February, it was making up references, and it wasn't that reliable. But I totally agree with you that it's a very useful starting point for a blank page, and it gets you going and it points you in the right direction. I just wouldn't trust it. I would always check everything on it, and you know, but it's so much better than, like you're saying, going on Google and getting 150 different leads. You know, it's a summary, it's a starting point. But you know, I've heard from people who've done PR, copywriting, marketing work, where people have just sacked the whole marketing, you know, writers in marketing departments and things, and AI has taken over all of that. So you can understand why writers are a bit.
That has not happened in our industry.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
and I must admit,
it's a specialist, because there's the specialism.
Yes, yeah. So,
but also, it just seems the way you just said that, Joan. You've said it to me before, and I always the way you just said that, it just sounds a bit extreme to me. I mean, how can you just you can't just lose the marketing department because of a AI tool? So, I mean, I think you should. Well, if you can say a little bit more about
I've been online in these Facebook, you know, copywriting groups and things, and it is quite astonishing the way things are changing very, very quickly for those people. But this is a different group of people. You know, Medcom's highly specialized technical writing. I can completely see AI is not up to that yet. But how long before it is? You know, won't be long.
I think it will be up to a lot of the right. No, Paul, sorry.
My question is, in a way that, like many other industries, with medcoms, I hope it won't go that way, but it's where the journalists become, you know, just overseeing, you know, curating a pile of work coming in rather than actually originating it, and that's already happened in large parts of our industry, as Joe very correctly says. Loads of jobs globally. Certainly in other countries, I think it will come here as well. And then the journalists are just seen effectively copy editors, or, you know, tickle copy around as well. Obviously, medcoms is a completely different kettle of fish, as we've said. Is, you know, the degree of accuracy and responsibility are absolutely paramount. But AI is changing every second of every day. And you know, it's a tool. Like any tool, it can be used or abused, and it always has a double-edged sword. As Joe said, you know, as journalists, we certainly can use it as and do as a jumping off point. I think certainly in journalism, it's very obvious at the moment, if you've relied on AI to any extent, and you'd get a very, you know, you'd find it very difficult to work after that. You know, you get a reputation, really. But it's changing. And I don't know how. I don't think any of us know, certainly in journalism, as freelance journalists, where it's going or how it will be used or misused. And I think certainly jobs are our big worry, really.
I think it certainly will as well. To your point, I think it will become, and what Peter was saying earlier about having, you know, things in wrappers, so that actually you know that the information that it's drawing from is credible, and you also, you know, will have a situation where, you know, the information that you put into it doesn't go outside of it. So I agree with you that I don't think it's kind of I don't think it's like, well, that's it, we don't need to worry about it because we're so highly specialised it can never do our job. I don't think that's the thing. I think it will become more of a useful tool in our job. But I think Lisa, who was speaking on Peter's webinar that he mentioned a few months ago, I think was 100% right when she talked about the need for medical writers to develop their critical thinking skills even more, because that's where we add the most value, and an AI tool does not do that and cannot do that at the moment to any extent, and it's just a kind of very sophisticated kind of predictive text type thing on a very large scale, and it's amazing. But yeah, I think it will come into our world in some sense, and we're going to have to be kind of ready for it and understand how to use it and understand where it is useful and where it can help to take some of the heavy lift of some of the work, but also what the limitations are and what we need to what we need to put around it to make sure that we as a company, it's our credibility as a company. We don't want to be producing machine written copy that's mediocre, as Peter said. That doesn't inspire me. It doesn't inspire anybody that I work with. We want to be producing the best communications that we can, and it almost becomes a challenge, doesn't it? I quite like a challenge.
But there is that counterpoint, which is, and you're facing it all the time, Annette, that the pharma clients who also expect the best, the most perfect, the most everything, wouldn't for a moment countenance mediocrity or whatever, are squeezing the budgets extremely hard. And actually, people being people, they'll go, well, actually, maybe we can get away with something a little bit less. And there's a constant conflict in there. Yeah. One of the things that I think was quite scary a few weeks ago was I think I've got this right. It was a freelance medical writer who said, my friend experienced this, and I'm pretty sure it was not, the my friend, i.e. me, had prepared let's call it a document, sent it to the client, and the client had run it through a AI detection piece of software, had come back to this friend and said 80% of this has been just generated by AI. Why on earth are we paying you to do this, right? And there was outrage and all sorts of things. Again, you're opening a can of worms there. I mean, my understanding, very limited that it is that AI detection tools are very poor. It's a very nice idea, and there's been lots of people running to do that, but actually it's very difficult. And probably what was happening in that scenario was not very good at all. But it sparked an enormously difficult situation for everyone to deal with. And I can entirely imagine procurement departments, in pharma companies and lots of other clients, starting to ask questions like that. Well, I thought it was interesting in the university environment, and I have my wife runs a large university department, so I've got at least a little bit of insight from a distance on it. She went from in early January saying this was all rubbish and she'd not heard of it, and I was getting a bit excitable, and she's just going, "Oh, just sod off, there's far more stuff that I've got to worry about." By the end of the month, if not quite a lot quicker, it was number one on the agenda at their directors' meetings, and they were getting professors of AI in to talk about it and whatever. If you look at it in education, it went from denial through to, one of the things that happened very early on was like in New York, they were banning use of AI. The kids, student just ban it, to a realization that they were already using it and you didn't know it and it was just happening, to a sort of point where then it was all about developing policies and supporting, how are we going to guide people as to how they should use it? And that then became, how can we teach them how to use it? Because this is all it's just a torrent, and we're just going to have to say, let's embrace it and let's go and encourage them and their critical thinking and so on, and use these tools, to a point where they were going, actually, you know what, this can save me an awful lot of time doing this and that, and I can start to make my life better. And that happened within, I would argue, from where I sat, within a few weeks. Within a few weeks, it was transformed. And I'm not quite sure where it went, but it seemed it was in a very, very different place. And nowadays, 6 months, 5 months after those initial sort of, what the hell are you talking about, Peter, type discussions, I would imagine a place like where Carolyn works, it's just a completely different environment from that point of view. People are using those tools. People are teaching about how to use those tools.
I mean,
and that's a
it
remarkable
worries me.
transformation.
Yeah, it does, and it worries me. Just, you know, this is worries me about society at large, because
Well, you said before that your concern is not so much about medcoms, medical writing, but just society as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. I think, you know, when you write something, it is a time-consuming process, and in that process, you are looking at different sources. You are deciding what to include, what not to include. You're processing and you're learning, and you know, the process gives you the understanding as the person who's written it. And because as a medical writer, you know, again, to the point that your job is a much broader than just the deliverable, the writing you deliver to the client. But I think, you know, again, like over society at large, you know, if kids are kind of just using these things and they're just spitting out stuff and they're checking it, yeah, that's right. They haven't seen that all they've seen is that kind of tip of the iceberg. If you've written the document, you've seen the whole iceberg and you know what's underneath the surface. So that's what worries me. There's going to be like nobody really knows anything. They just know that there's no foundations. It's like shaky, and that's what worries me about society. Because I think that's we're all lazy, and even though I say there's, you know, I'm time poor as well, and you know, we're all against lots of different, you know, kind of pressures, and that's what it worries me, that no one's going to think for themselves in the future. So
but then there's an element. No, exactly, but there's an element of, and I know I'm messing around with this slightly, but I can very clearly remember my dad getting very upset when I was allowed to use calculators at school, and my dad telling me that this was outrageous and it would stop me understanding how to do the basic maths. And you know, these sorts of things are there's a
line somewhere, isn't there? Because and I agree that it's a tool and a calculator's a tool, and I think we can go that, but I just feel like this kind of goes one step further. I don't know.
Well, remember, video didn't kill the radio star. You know, you still got radio out there, even though we got video. You know, and that kind of thing is still important. I think similarly, someone else said exactly the same thing you did, Peter. You know, calculators did not completely wipe out maths. You still need that, you know, skill to be able to do that.
But
I mean,
I've got two teenage boys, and it scares the hell out of me how little they think about anything. Yeah, and it's, you know, it does seem like we're on a slippery slope, because I think my dad thinks that of me, and I'm thinking that of my boys. You know, and you know, if they want to go somewhere, they don't. You know, I listened to someone actually very entertainingly talking about his kids. You know, going to Southampton or something like that. They've got no concept of where Southampton is from where we are in Oxford. They just have no concept, because they would just ask Google to tell them which way to go, and they would start following Google. And you know, but I'm not. I'm a bit. I am a bit of the old fart who says this is terrible and we're all doomed. But there's another part of me that goes, actually, this is just very different. And you know, and with this, what we're talking about is something that's going to change things a lot. But it's just going to be very different, and kids and whatever are going to grow up in a slightly different world and find different ways of doing things. Sorry, Mike, we're talking over you. Sorry, you're trying to say something.
Fine. No. First of all, just a comment. I sit on our NHS Ethics Committee, and you mentioned about the slowdown in jobs in this area. And I know that during COVID, there were very few clinical trials being performed on new chemical entities, and I'm just wondering whether that might be a result of that you're seeing now in terms of the slowdown. The next question I've got is, again, around the clinical trials. When we look at clinical trials protocols and the patient information leaflets that are constructed, the ones that are most beneficial are the ones that have had true patient information input. And I'm just wondering how relevant ChatGPT is to that, because these are the people that really understand the condition, and in terms of engaging with them, with the pharmaceutical companies that you work with. I think that would be really meaningful. And the third one is a question. And I do a lot of reading of scientific papers, and I think that most researchers have like an innate requirement to produce positive results in their papers. And there's always the Occam's broom, as I call it, where they sweep away all the bits that aren't relevant, hopefully hide it somewhere. But when you actually look at the statistics and start to look and interpret the statistics, that's where you see the thing beginning to unravel. And I'm just wondering how adept ChatGPT is. And you mentioned pharma ChatGPT, which I think is probably really important with pharmaceutical industry clients, because they obviously want to get more positive outcomes from their data than they possibly can. I'm just wondering how good ChatGPT and pharma ChatGPT is in terms of getting to the nub of the real information that's relevant in the papers that are produced, and where they do become the Occam's razor as opposed to the Occam's broom.
I'm going to jump straight in, and just because I think it's important we clarify a point that you seem to be hinting at. And Pharma GPT is not a database of positive pharmaceutical industry information to be put out there for people to get positive results from. Pharma GPT is a specific thing that Steve Mott's building around SPCs and so on, the regulated type of drug information and patient information leaflets and drug interaction information. And the point of Pharma GPT is simply that you can have a huge database that's beyond a human being able to know everything of thing. A huge database of very rigorously controlled information, ask it a question and get an answer in a meaningful way. So I just wanted to be sure that we were clear on that one.
So it's not like the statins database then?
No, it's not. No, and you're going in a direction there, which we could turn this into a long discussion.
Yeah,
I appreciate that. I would be less cynical about what pharma's trying to do than perhaps you're hinting at there. But the point is, if you take a huge database of information that's rigorously controlled, then you can ask potentially more meaningful questions of that than just going ChatGPT. Okay. I just wanted to clarify that. But I'm sorry, that was me jumping on that one. But Annette, what do you think about the more general points there?
Well, I think, I think turning to this kind of clinical trial patient involvement thing, and I think, we've got our clinical trial experience team, and there's, I think there is so much more to developing those materials. I agree with you, Mike, that, I don't think, and probably to Peter's point, it maybe can do a mediocre job, but, that's not what we want. It's not what we need to really make sure that the right patients get on the right trials, and that we make sure that we get drugs to market as soon as possible. And I think that to develop really good quality materials, I still think that we need to have that true patient understanding and involvement. And I don't, again, you can write it in a chatty way in ChatGPT and it can be a bit more accessible, but I don't, I wouldn't want to go down that route. Personally.
Again, I don't think we should equate the two exactly. So, I mean, I said to begin with, and to the point Mike's making, I mean, there's a lot more involvement of real patients, patient advocates, patient groups in all sorts of communications these days. And medcoms as a specialism, still, I mean, I think we've said before, isn't tending to be orientated and focused on the patients. But even what we do with medcoms is much more bringing the patient voice into it. I mean, there are other agencies, I would argue, elsewhere on the communication spectrum that are very much about producing and much more focused on producing information for patients. And there's just a lot more involvement in patients and getting the patient voice in those, which is a good thing. We would all agree with it. I think one of the things we could have a long discussion about is whether you're getting the right patients involved in this sort of stuff, because there is a tendency to go for patient advocates who become a self-defining group of people rather than actually the real patients. I mean, you can just get on with that argument forever and ever, and you never get entirely the right patient to have the right sort of input into what you want for that person, personalization, all the rest of it. But generally, and again, I speak as someone who's been around the industry for a long time, I would have said when I was a young man, everyone around me, we were all doing things for patients. We were all listening to patients. We were all, of course, that's what we were doing. The reality is we probably weren't very much. And there's a lot more emphasis these days on making sure that happens. But there's also a lot of emphasis these days on having meetings of like doctors talking about what patients need to do. And there was a very good example recently of a meeting of doctors, how the patient should be dealt with and there was no patient in sight, sort of thing. That's not an industry specific thing, but certainly as an industry, we are bringing people in more, and that can only be a good thing, but it will never be perfect. Sorry, Jo.
Peter, could I just ask a question? I mean, you all might be able to answer it, but we're talking about patient advocacy. Is that an area where journalistic skills are particularly useful? I mean, I spend a lot of my life talking to people with medical conditions and writing about how they feel about it, how they've managed it, what medication they take, that type of thing. Is there a place for that in medcoms at all? Or, you know, are our skills in that sense transferable?
I think there is probably not so much in medical education, which is what my team focuses on, but our PR team would do those kinds of communications for sure.
Yeah, and if I can jump in there and just say, yeah, Joe, I mean, I've done a lot of charity disease awareness for doctors as well as patients as well as carers, but I think one of the skills that journalists, perhaps healthcare writers, have is they're you know, much more at ease perhaps talking to patients, interviewing them, listening to them, speaking to them on a direct basis, on a one-to-one basis, whereas perhaps you might get more sort of academic scientific writers who a little bit less confident doing that kind of thing with patients. That's perhaps where, you know, journalists can bring their skills into things. And as Annette says, you know, there's a lot of information out there that is directed to patients, and you need to be able to speak to them to find out what the facts are out there.
Okay.
And again, I would just I think we've said it in several different ways that medcoms tends not to be communicating with patients, but we're very careful. We're trying to be very, or I'm trying to be very careful what I'm saying, because that makes it sound a bit sort of siloed and a bit simplistic. Medcoms is a very broad church of activity. So a lot of medcoms agencies, probably most medcoms agencies, will do some patient type orientated type activity, but there are other agencies that do a lot sort of thing. So there's always going to be an interest in that, and I would say those sorts of transferable skills are very transferable and very useful. It might be a question of knocking on some different doors to find out where it sort of fits, and it may not be, and it's not as simple as going, does a medcoms agency want these sorts of skills, because they're all very different sort of. Do you see what I mean? We've just got to keep the nuance in there and make it a little less siloed sort of thing. But as a generalization, there's a lot of more medcoms agencies and more agencies generally that are doing more for and with patients, and need skills of people who have got experience of working with patients and so on. And those journalistic skills of interpreting information can be very important. But there is a degree of luck and randomness about this. I mean, let's face up to the, you know, an important part of this conversation was, you know, what opportunities are in medcoms for, you know, people from, you know, of your sorts of more journalistic type backgrounds and so on. I mean, I would say that, you know, it's easy for me to say there are opportunities, of course. If you meet the right people and you happen to be there at the right time, then yes, of course, there's opportunities. Whether that's an easy thing to do, I don't know. And in an environment where freelance work generally is a bit quieter at the moment, it's going to be more difficult. But then you have got unique skills. You know, your typical medcoms type freelancer has a certain set of skills. Again, I'm oversimplifying it here. Your typical medcoms agency, your typical medcoms freelancer, you know, if there are such things, you know, that's great. But there's plenty of them, and that's a bit. But you get someone a little bit of different, and an agency that requires a little bit of a different sort of a skill, and you match those at the right time. Great. That, though, does require you to go and knock on some doors and put yourself about and flag yourself as someone that's going to be there at the right time. That's difficult. That's difficult for any sort of freelancer, you know. And I'm sure, again, Annette, you could talk a bit about it, or Corinne, from your perspective. I mean, you know, I run one little service which tries to help match people, clients and freelancers, and it works up to a point, but it's no magic answer for anybody. And there's lots of different platforms out there where people are getting involved. I mean, just throwing a few around, but there's, I don't know, it must be worth having a look at these. And Corinne, certainly, am I saying anything stupid here? You know, Farmer Lances is a new service which is trying to develop database of freelance writers and so on. Talus is a platform which is about matching freelancers and agencies. BioMe Professionals.
That's right.
I'd be a bit dismissive of, but I shouldn't be. Sean's tried to do something there. I just don't think it works very well. But there's plenty of people who've joined in with it. You've got directories in places like MWare. I don't know whether you have at the Guild, but you know, directories and things. I mean, and on LinkedIn, of course. I mean, people are, you know, people do things in different ways, but people are looking for people. What else out there? You know, Juno, things like that. Yeah, there's platforms out there which, to lesser or greater or not extents, are part of this mix. And my simplistic suggestion to anyone interested in whether medcoms could provide some work is, to be frank, that you've got to put yourself about in most of those sorts of places, and maybe in the end you'll not know whether one's worked or the other one's worked, but little butterfly wings over here make something happen over here, sort of thing. But there are places that you can go where you can start to sort of at least put you, and some of them are completely free and some of them cost you, and there's decisions to be made in there. But does that make sense, Corin? Have you what other?
Yeah, I think one of the main things perhaps is LinkedIn. I mean, Peter, when you started all those years ago with medcoms, I think one of the main things you always emphasized is you've got to get out there and market yourself. You can't just sit back and expect it to come to you, no matter how successful you are. I think LinkedIn's been very successful for many people, but you've got to get out there and position yourself. You know, that gives you a chance to say, okay, I specialize in this, I don't specialize in that, or whatever. I mean, I don't particularly write tons of clinical manuscripts, but I do a bunch of other stuff too. So point is, where do you fall? You know, use something like LinkedIn or some of the directories to position yourself. You know, what do you specialize in? Maybe you try it and you think, okay, it wasn't quite what I was looking for, so let's move more over to this particular area. You don't like medical education, but maybe like patient education. You know, for example, we were talking about PR. That is a great opportunity for journalists to move into more promotional stuff, because PR
I was going to say exactly the same thing. I think, you know, understanding the kind of, from my understanding of the kind of skill set, I think that would be probably the route in, is to, you know, to healthcare PR, because, you know, that is still a thriving business. It still is specialist, but the types of writing that they do is less specialized, I suppose, and is more journalistic. And so, you know, journalistic specialized, I don't want to downgrade that, of course, but not so kind of nuanced, I suppose, in terms of the type of work. And I think, you know, for example, we've got a healthcare PR part of our business, as I mentioned, and there's writers in that, and they have come from, you know, different backgrounds to my medical writers in my team, for example. But then, you know, there is a little bit of crossover as well between our team and theirs, and sometimes, you know, our medical writers will support the PR team and things like that. So, you know, if it's kind of route in to kind of do some healthcare kind of PR type writing, then you may find you get exposed to, you know, it's all on a gradient. There's not like sort of, you know, there's not a black and white where PR starts and med-ed, you know, med-ed it finishes and goes into med-ed. So, you know, that might provide some exposure into different types of healthcare work, particularly if obviously you do a great job. Then, you know, a lot of things from a freelance perspective, as in all industries, it's all kind of word of mouth, and somebody will say, oh, this person was great, you know, and from a project basis, we'll be like, oh, we're looking for a writer, we need this, and, you know, the team will be like, oh, I worked with this person and they did, I don't know, some blog posts for X, Y, and Z, and actually they were really good. And it might be that we're like, okay, well, we need a medical writer to sort of do the sort of sciencey piece, but actually we want a more of a journalistic approach to it, to make the article read beautifully, have a good hook, you know, all those kinds of things. And it might be that there's a sort of, you know, team working on things. So I would say healthcare PR is a good route in, potentially.
Yeah, I think so. And you know, people have contacted me and said, okay, this is the article, we need it in a different tone of voice. You know, can you write it a little bit more well, for someone who perhaps doesn't understand all the academic details, you know, take out the clinical jargon. And perhaps that's not something perhaps the AI can do, but as a journalist, you might be able to.
The challenge is still being in the right place at the right time, because, you know, it's and all the various systems that various people have tried, because technology, you can easily put together a story where you go, just need a big database. I mean, you know, and maybe AI even helps, you know, big database. So get all the freelancers with all their skills and get them to write down what they can do. And then a client can just come in and magically find them. And that always falls over because they're human beings, and those freelancers don't keep their details up to date or don't put all their, etc. There's no magic answer to any of this. I was actually, oh, sorry, Lyndon, but can I just give Rosie a shout out? Is Rosie going to, he seems to, because I just know Rosie, so Rosie might have a view because she crosses this a little bit. It might be a bit unfair, Rosie, because I just saw you appear there and I thought, well, maybe you've got a comment on this since you straddle both areas. And you're the one person I know in the audience.
Yeah, I apologise because I joined rather late, so I missed the first sort of half hour or so, I guess, of this. But I wear multiple hats, as Peter knows, and certainly I will use journalists but it tends to be more the medical journalists rather than the health journalists, so people with a science background, because just find that they can make that crossover a bit more. And what's the sort of common issue is if people are looking to switch from one to the other or switch between them, is the sort of commercial understanding of the pharma industry and what they're looking for and what medcoms agencies offer. And it's hard to sort of, you have slightly put me on the spot, Peter.
I know, I'm sorry. I apologise.
No, that's okay. It's hard to kind of define
Part of the fun of it.
the skills that you need, but it's not just a case of switching from one to the other. But certainly there are plenty of jobs. I mean, I'm thinking of plain language summaries in particular, and some of the website work that I do, where having the journalism skills are a big advantage that medcoms writers don't have. So medcoms writers tend to have the scientific knowledge and the commercial knowledge, but not the skills to make a nice story. And one of the issues that I think I've raised with you, Peter, before is that I can't get ChatGPT to give us a nice intro, for example.
Right.
So it'll come up with a sort of nice little summary, which you then have to fact check on. But I haven't yet been able to get it to come up with a nice newsy or even feature style intro and that sort of journalism structure to a piece that is often needed in the kind of work that I do. But having said that, I think I would do more work for patients, with patients, or sort of aimed at patients, than a typical medcoms agency, perhaps. But I've noticed that it's the journalism side of things is a skill that's definitely missing from a lot of medcoms agencies, even the ones that say they specialise in patient.
Again, there's just this vast spectrum of activity out there, and you can't take the bit of everybody and add it into one thing and go, there's the perfect writer for the perfect situation. Lyndon, sorry, I did skip over you. You had your hand up.
No, don't worry.
It's
fascinating stuff. It's I think it's shown there's probably still going to be a market for copy editors and proofreaders, because we just can't trust this technology. It's a bit like predictive text. It's not. That's got better over the last few years, but sort of 15 years ago, predictive text wasn't that good. It would always give you the wrong word. And I think ChatGPT is like that at the moment. But I was wondering if anybody had tried doing it. I recently had to, last year, write an article for a spectral flow cytometry sort of machine that was new, to launch it into the Singaporean market and the Indian market. They wanted two different articles for the different markets. Has ChatGPT got, can it take into context, this is what the Indian market's looking like, or this is what the Singaporean market's like, or this is how to word it for those? Because they do have very specifically different ways of looking at technology.
I think, Lyndon, we're going to have to make that the last question, because we're kind of overrunning and we've got a committee meeting. But I think we could talk for a long time about all of this, couldn't we? There's a lot of material there. So thank you to all the speakers for your inputs. I think it's given us all a lot to think about, and some optimism, perhaps, that we have got some transferable skills that might be useful in the medcom sector. So definitely. There was just one point I wanted to make that Corinne said earlier, which was about how the pay is so much better. The day rates that you're talking about for copywriting and things were, what was it, £450 a day or something? Or
I think on average, and this is a range of from junior to senior, it's around, I think 430 was one of the recent ones that came up. But obviously that's based on how long the day is, for example, and exactly what your rates are. So I tend to charge on an hourly basis, as I've said before, because in some cases people are saying a day is 7 hours, other people are saying it's 10, and you do get agencies that expect you to work that long. So it helps. Obviously, the other thing to do is remember a lot of journalists work on a word count basis. You can't really do that in medcoms because it does vary so much. If you're writing a press release, if you're writing a social media post, if you're writing a long manuscript, it's not necessarily just words. There's a lot more that goes into it. So again, I would think about project basis or an hourly basis as far as charges go.
Okay.
Most people would charge an hourly basis.
Right.
For their writing.
Yeah.
Okay.
On that note, I mean, it's just important to bear in mind again, there's a spectrum out there, and there's just a couple of things that might be worth looking at, or if you want to, just reach out on LinkedIn and I can send the references later. But EMWA, the European Medical Writers Association, their latest survey from 2021 was published at the end of 2022 in the journal on the EMWA website. And that includes an indicator towards sort of rates, writers' rates, and so on.
Okay.
And I was involved in supporting a project, which a survey that was done in sort of May of this year. And it was primarily looking at agencies and rates, but it might be interesting for you to look at the amounts, the salaries and things. But there was again a specific section for freelancers, which does come out sort of 450 sort of as a sort of a peak number, but there's a range around it. So anything like that, I think you just got to be careful of. But there's at least a couple of surveys there that people can go and have a look at. EMWA and ours. If you look at my surveys page, it's probably as easy to find it, or just drop me a line. Just be very careful because individuals charge very different rates for different sorts of projects. Agencies, companies, it's very different. So just be very careful because it's not everyone wants someone like me. They come to me, what's the rate for a medical writer, Peter? And you go, how do I answer that? But as someone looking at this business, is there opportunity for me to get involved in it? One of the questions you must be asking yourself is, what are they paying? And to get a sense of the sort of range of rates and the sorts of projects that are done and so on. So at least there's a couple of surveys that you can go and have a look at there if that helps. Yeah.
Okay, one more thing. Remember that if you're a freelance medical writer, an agency, whatever agency I work for, will probably triple my fees to charge that to the pharmaceutical company. So, there's a difference. Yeah.
Okay.
Obviously, people have budgets.
We certainly don't do that.
Yeah, but
so that you know.
I am familiar with a lot of agencies that do. Yeah.
That's a wildly simplistic remark from Corinne there to finish on, but
of
course they do mark it up. Well,
Yeah.
of course they mark it up, but then the question is, do you want to work for the pharmaceutical company directly and charge higher rates, which of course some people do, and of course there's a logic to it, but trying to get the work as a freelancer from a pharmaceutical company can be extremely difficult.
Very difficult,
in lots of ways, but again, lots of there is opportunity there, and if I was if I was in a position as a freelance health writer, I'd be looking around at all sorts of opportunities and trying to get my name known and trying to meet people and to network people. And if it happens to be a medical affairs person in a pharma company that needs some certain sort of work being done, then of course they can, if they want to, employ a freelancer, and it can be very, very lucrative. So lots of different scenarios. I just think we have to be a little careful there with oversimplifying generalization.
Okay.
But there is lots of work out there. There's definitely lots of work out there.
That's good news. Yeah, and I think we're going to have to wrap up now. But thank you so much for everyone who's contributed and for the expert speakers and your input. It's been very invaluable to us. And see you again soon in a committee meeting in 10 minutes, actually, for some of us. So.